Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us for our monthly webinar. It's great to see so many familiar names in the chat, but for those who don't know me, my name is Bruce Anthony and I'm a trainer with CERVIS Technologies. Now, before we jump into our subject for today, I want to ensure that you know you can ask questions throughout the webinar by using the questions tab. You should see that towards the bottom or on the side next to a hand raising icon. We have a team answering questions throughout, and if there are any questions that are good for the entire group, they'll also pass those along to me, and we'll address those together at the end. Hopefully you're also aware that all of our recorded webinars from the past are available on our YouTube channel. If you go to video.servicetech.com, you'll find that. We'll kind of take a look at that again later as well. But with that, let's go ahead and get started. Well, as it's the end of the year, it's time to look again at all the available options as you're approaching your end of year reporting. There are a lot of different types of reports that you can choose to run depending on your organizational needs or potentially things like grant writing. A lot of times that can dictate what types of reports you need and what types of data you need. These can be as simple as selecting a date range and clicking Run Report, or they can be a little bit more involved if you're looking to pull particular pieces of information. But we'll explore all these different types of reports available and how you can customize them to pull the information that you're looking for. And as I mentioned before, please use the chat if you have questions about specific types of data you'd like to see in a report, and maybe how to run that, especially if you're not sure how to do so. So to start off, in CERVIS, there really are kind of two different types of reports. There are what you might call data reports, pulling things like spreadsheets of information about volunteers, maybe just information from volunteer profiles, or information from your events themselves. And then there's the other side, which is probably more what we're talking about today with end of year reporting, which would be things like running hours or impact reporting. And pretty much all of that's going to be done in the report management tool. But I do want to briefly talk about kind of that data report aspect first. That's a little bit more simple, and just to make sure you're aware of those options that exist too. So for example, in the volunteer management side of CERVIS, if you go into search and manage the volunteer database, you can run a search for a set of volunteers using maybe a previously saved search you've created, or using the advanced search tool, or maybe you just want to pull every volunteer's information. If you leave the search bar blank here, click Search Volunteer Database. That'll pull up everyone's info. In the top of this page or in the top of this section, there's a checkbox you can use to select everyone. And then from there, you can use this drop down to run a number of different downloads, is what they're referred to in here. And these are basically like data reports, right? So one example of that is like an address labels. That's an example of a data report, just volunteer information. If you're sending out mailers, of course, that's a quick way to do that. PDF is another example of that. This is just like kind of what you see here, really, the volunteer's contact info, a little bit more contact information as well, but that's just a quick download of a PDF of contact information. The real kind of meaty option for running a data report on the volunteer side is a spreadsheet. And if you open up this option, click on Download Volunteer Spreadsheet, this will pop up two default options, basic contact info and a full spreadsheet. You can see these are also referred to as exports. They both are also called built-in. These are kind of the two existing options, but you can also create additional models or additional exports through here. If we click on Add New Custom Spreadsheet or Export Profile, that allows us to customize exactly what fields we're looking to pull out of the system. And again, I would refer to this as a data report because you're pulling volunteer information. If you're exporting information and importing it into another platform or using that data in some other form or fashion, this is what this tool is kind of intended to do. You can select exactly how much information you want to include. You can see name, phone, email are selected automatically, but we could say, let's include address or alternate phone number, emergency contact info, maybe birth date or background check information, right? So there's all kinds of things. Everything you're tracking, basically, you can go through and select through here. There's also stuff in here that you might not be aware that CERVIS is tracking, or maybe you didn't know. It's stuff that volunteers can't necessarily see themselves per se, or that they're not entering, like their start date, which is basically when their account was created, how many years of service they have with you. You can include notes in this export. The last time they signed your terms is also a date you can include. And then this report does allow you to include things like lifetime activity count and lifetime hours. So this kind of does get into the more, hours or impact reporting. But again, this is a lifetime metric. You're not specifying a date range here. So again, this is a more of what I would still term a data export. So once you've made all your selections here, you can also move these fields around. So maybe you're importing information into a particular platform and it wants it in a certain format. You can drag and drop different fields here to change where they show up or what order they show up in that export. And then of course you can just give it a title. So you can call this whatever you'd like to. You can make it public or private. If it's public, that means that any of your staff can use this. If it's private, only administrators and yourself. But once we build this out, click on Save Custom Export at the bottom. This will now always show up as an option. When you go in to download a spreadsheet, you will see that option that you've created listed amongst the two built-ins. Of course, you can go and edit this. If you want to update that, you can, or you can delete it. But if you just want to pull that report, you can click on Download, and that would basically just download a CSV file. Okay, so that's one data export that you can use to pull volunteer information. There's also a similar sort of export on the opportunity database side. If we go into search and manage existing opportunities, you'll be able to see in here, same kind of formatting. You can run a search, select all the events you want to, and then in here, there's a bunch of printouts you can create, right? So the bunch of sign-in sheets and things like that. But the sort of export, at least if you want to call it that, in these terms would be something like down here towards the bottom, you can export opportunity details, right? So this is just pulling event information. Again, kind of akin to exporting volunteer info, more of a data dump than it is actually, pulling hours or impact. Okay, so that's kind of that side of reporting. Again, more of like the data report. Let's switch gears and talk more about hours and impact reporting. So how do you run reports over the last year that tell you how many hours were served and who contributed those and in what categories those were contributed? There are a lot of different reporting methods in Service. Most of them are contained in the report management tool. So if we go into this tool, you'll see there's a bunch of different reporting options in here, and there's a date range at the top. Most of these reports use this date range. Each report will tell you whether or not it uses the date range with this calendar icon. If you mouse over this one, you can see it says date range required. If we go a little bit further down, you can see a couple examples where it says date range not used. It's got kind of that red dot on it, letting you know this isn't going to use the date range because there's a different way to specify kind of what you're pulling here. Or some of these reports don't really use the date range at all because they have like a specific set of information they're pulling to begin with. So there are a bunch of reports in here that are intended to be quick and easy. If you're just looking to quickly pull information from your system, a lot of times you can just set a date range. So we could go back to January 1st of this year. We could go through today or project through the end of the month if we wanted to. Typically, I recommend not necessarily doing that because you don't necessarily know if people will actually attend the shifts they're registered for. But either way, you can set your date range here, and then we can pick a report to run. I'm going to talk about this custom report in a little bit. This one's a little bit more involved generally. But if you just want to quickly run a report, there are a number of these that can be used to just pump out information right away. For example, number 2, event or project participation report. The names of these reports kind of hint at the kind of hierarchic sorting that they use. So for example, this second report, event or project participation, is going to sort all of your opportunities by the opportunities themselves. They're either going to be sorted by name or by date, depending on what you select through here, but you're effectively going to be getting summaries on a per event basis. So I'm going to go ahead and run this report. Let me exit full screen so that we can actually download these. And if I run this report here, again, we set this to kind of the January 1st to today. I'm going to leave all these options as the default. So we're getting a low detail version of this report. There are other options in here, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But if we go ahead and run this report, this is going to pull as a Word document because I have that specified as my format at the top. Most of these reports allow you to choose if you prefer a Word document or a spreadsheet, but there are some of them that will say spreadsheet only, and then it doesn't matter what format you have selected here, it'll always pull as a spreadsheet. But let's go ahead and open that report here. So again, that's going to open as a Word document, and if we pull this across, you can see that this one is, again, sorted by the name of the event. And I had it sorted by the name, not by the date and time. So these are all sorted alphabetically here. And I chose to do a low detail report, which basically means I'm just getting a summary for each event. So I see the number of volunteers, registrations, and hours for each of these events. And then down at the bottom of the report, I will also get a report total. Now, let me talk really quick about these metrics. We'll see these numbers throughout Service as we're running reports. So opportunities and events, oftentimes that kind of terminology is used interchangeably, but opportunities is the number of entities, that have hours within them during whatever report range, you're running. So I had 35 opportunities during the last year. Volunteers is exactly what it sounds like, but you can see there's an asterisk here. It says the volunteers value includes numbers only for individual volunteers, not group registrations. So that's important to pay attention to. Service does not assume if you have done bulk group registrations, the system will not assume that those bulk registrations are unique volunteers. So those numbers do not get tallied into this unique volunteer count. The unique volunteer count uses individuals who have unique profiles in your system. So that's what this number is reflecting. If you want to assume that groups are contributing unique volunteers, if you're doing bulk group registrations, and again, this is not having anything to do with reservations. So if you're using reservations, you can just kind of ignore this. But if you're using bulk group registrations and you want to assume that all of your groups are contributing individual volunteers, you can run reports that would just pull the group numbers and you can add that number in to your unique volunteer count. But otherwise, the system is just pulling this based on individuals who have profiles in your system who contributed hours in this report. Registrations is, again, exactly what it sounds like. This is how many times people walked in the door, contributed hours. So we can see in my case, I have 241 unique volunteers who contributed 1,600 registrations. The big disparity there basically means that I have people who are consistently working with me regularly, right? So people are averaging about 7 or 8 participations with me. All right, and then hours is, again, exactly what it sounds like. This is how many hours were contributed throughout this report. And those credit hours are based on how you build out your events. So when you create an opportunity, specifically an event, a normal event or a time slot event, you specify the credit hours that that event is worth. That is the value that gets carried over for each registration, unless you're using the sign-in console. And then those hours are being modified based on volunteers signing in and signing out. So those numbers can get modified. And you can also independently modify those hours too. When you are looking at a specific opportunity, if you go into manage registrations on an event, let's say I want to look at last week's registrations here, I can go in and modify how many hours someone is receiving manually. If I want to give someone more or less credit, I can go and adjust that independently for each person. And again, the sign-in console will also do that automatically if you are using the sign-in console to have volunteers sign in and out. Okay, so that's kind of the numbers that we're talking about when we're talking about reporting and service. The number of opportunities, numbers of unique volunteer accounts, numbers of registrations, and numbers of hours. Now, I want to be clear. I mentioned that Service doesn't tally in group registrations for that unique volunteer count. But of course, those bulk group registrations do count towards the registration count as well as the hours count. So you don't need to be concerned about losing information there, unless you are explicitly running a report to exclude that data, which you would need to choose to do. Okay, so let's talk about some other kind of quick reporting options. We just looked at this event or project participation report. There's also a volunteer participation report, which again, the names of these reports kind of tell you what they're sorting by. This report is going to sort by individual volunteers. Now I want to break down some of the detail differences here. So if we run this volunteer participation report in low detail, I'm gonna go ahead and run this the same date range we used previously. So we're looking at basically a whole year. It's gonna print out a Word document. And you can see for this document, we have each person listed out. We see their name, phone, email, and then we see their registrations and hours, right? So again, I just want to point out this information is our demonstration console. This isn't real info. Obviously, all these phone numbers are fake, but just wanted to point that out. Each of these people, though, I'm seeing here only the low detail report. So I'm just seeing totals for these individuals, the names of the individuals, and then their totals. And then, of course, if we go to the bottom of this report, we'll also see the totals for the entire report, right? So we're going to see that information reflected here. Same kind of numbers that we saw previously, right? So this is the low detail version of this report. The high detail version is just going to give us kind of the next layer of information. So for this particular report, that means that we're going to see each registration, right? Not just a total for each person. We'll see actually every single registration that they did. So if we go ahead and run this as a high detail report instead, it's going to also produce a Word document. But if we open that up, you can see that this report is going to give us not just the summary for each person, but also what they did. So we see the names of the shifts that they registered for, when that shift was, how many hours that was worth. So we're basically getting a total for each person, as well as seeing what they did. So that's kind of what that low versus high detail will do in this particular report. In different reports, it means different things. It's basically just expounding on the amount of information being presented. If you're not totally sure, just run one. It's not super hard to kind of float between those, and most of them are pretty understandable. Like if we look at the group participation report, the low detail version gives us a summary for the group. That's kind of the name of the report. So how many people are in that group? How many times did they serve? How many hours did they serve? The medium detail version of this report would tell us the names of the individuals and give us totals for those individuals. And then the high detail version of this report would tell us every single registration that each person did. Right? But all of these reports are going to also give us those totals. So again, most of these kind of reports, 2, 3, 4, number 5 here, I want to talk about this more in a moment. These are kind of designed to be quick reports. If you just want to quickly view, okay, January 1st to today, how many hours were served, you kind of pick what you want to be your sorting. Now, a lot of times that's report number 5. This is the interest category participation report. What this report does is it uses your interest categories to sort your events. Now, interest categories are something that you concern yourself with every time you create an event. When you add an opportunity into Service, you need to define a primary category, and you can attribute a secondary category. For a lot of you, that's not going to be necessary. Often, primary category is sufficient. For most organizations, interest categories represent programs. Sometimes, if you operate out of disparate physical locations, you might also use interest categories to represent those locations. And that's a lot of times when the secondary category comes into play. But with these categories kind of set on individual events, you can then use those to run reports. A lot of times we talk about these interest categories as functioning like folders. You know, when you create your event, it's getting logged into this particular interest category. And now if we go back into reporting, you know, we can go and select to run a report on that category, right? So you can choose a particular category and run a report on all of the events within that category. So you can choose a category to run, or you can say, show me everything and just run a report on that. If you're doing this option to show all categories, it's going to give you summaries by interest category. If you do low detail, that's all you'll see. If you do medium detail, you'll see all the events within those categories and each of the summaries for those events. If you do high detail, you'll see every single registration, right? If you are running this interest category report and you're saying show all categories, you'll want to pay attention to whether you use primary or secondary categories or both. Now, for most organizations, it's completely sufficient to say show all and just leave this as primary. That will show you all of your events. Every event in your system has to have a primary category. So by the nature of this report, it cannot exclude any information. So this report will always give you all of your registrations if you leave it as show all and primary. If you're doing something a little bit different, like in my system, I have a sites or locations kind of section for my interest categories, and I always assign these as a secondary category. So when I run this report, I could say choose secondary here, and then run this by sites or locations, and then that would show me all of my events filtered by location, as opposed to if I run this as primary, then that's going to show me all my events filtered by program. Now this just has specifically to do with how I set up my interest categories. Your interest categories will not necessarily look like this. It depends on how you've created them and how you're using them, how you'd want to run this report. But at a minimum, if you leave this as show all and primary, then that will show you all of your activity within the date range. So you're going to see all of your events, again, filtered by interest category. Let me just show you really quickly for mine. If I do programs, because that's how I have mine kind of set up, we'll do low detail here. If we run this report, again, it's going to be a Word document because I specified that at the top. But you can see here I'm getting totals for each category. So I have my titles for the categories, admin office, and then how many opportunities, volunteers, registrations, hours. So again, the same numbers and totals that we were talking about and looking at earlier, but we're seeing those represented for different categories. And then of course, down at the bottom, we'll see, again, our report total. So again, if you run this report as show all and primary, which is the default here, this will give you all of your hours over whatever date range you're looking at. So if you just want a quick number, filter by interest category, this is how you'd run it. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about kind of some more specific reports that you might run if you're looking for more specific data. I want to start with this yearly participation summary. This one can be used to be a quick report, or you can use it to be a little bit more in depth as well. You kind of have the option here as you're looking at it. The default behavior of this report is to be like a quick report. So you can see it has this section for queries. What this allows you to do is to apply filters so that you're not looking at all of your data. You're only looking at a bit of your data, basically what you've searched for. We'll talk about that more in a minute, but for right now, you can see it says all volunteers, all groups, all opportunities. So that's going to show us everything, right? This report also allows us to specify, instead of using the date range, we specify a starting year and month. This is intended to be like a monthly summary. So that's kind of how this report refers to itself. You can see, obviously, it's called a yearly participation summary by month. So if we wanted to run this for a calendar year, like 2023, we would start in January 2023. And then again, I can specify if I want low, medium, or high detail. I can specify I want to sort by the event name or by the date within each month. That's kind of up to you as you're running this. But if I go ahead and run this report, it's basically going to give me, again, a summary for each month for 12 months starting on whatever I picked to start with. So if we go ahead and run this report, again, it's a Word document. We're getting a summary for each month. I said low detail, so I'm just seeing the totals. So in January, here's our numbers. February, here's our numbers, right? All the way through the end of the year, we get the totals down at the bottom for the entire year. This is also a great report to just quickly view your hours, especially if you just want to sort this information by month. Now we did low detail. If we had done medium detail, it would also give us the names of the opportunities, and then high detail would show us every single registration if we want to see the volunteers' names in there too. But generally, if I'm running a report like this, I want to do low or medium detail. Now, the nice thing about this report is, let's say most of your reporting is done on fiscal year reporting, not calendar year reporting. Well, then you can just go and change your start month, right? So if you need to start your reporting in April, you can choose that as your starting month, and then it will just give you 12 months from that date. And again, it's going to give you ultimately a summary for each month and a summary for the entire either calendar or fiscal year. Okay, so again, this report can be a quick report, but you can also use these queries to make this a little bit more complex. Let's say, for example, you are applying for a grant that only applies to a subset of your events. Well, what you can do is search for those opportunities and then use that query to limit what shows up in your report. If we go into opportunity management, go into search and manage existing opportunities, hopefully you have some method to search for those events that apply toward that particular grant. If not, you'll need to create something. Generally, I use tags. So for example, I have a tag in my system that refers to a specific grant. I can search by the name of that tag here, or I could use the tag cloud and just click in to search by it as well. That's also a viable option. If you have some other way of searching for these events, maybe it's just based on interest category or who the point of contact is or where it's located, you can use the advanced search to do that as well. If you have kind of a complex way to search for these events, you might want to save a search. Right, go and run your search one time, then down here, click to save a search, give it a title. That way you don't have to go and rerun all those parameters every time. But once you've run your search, so I've searched for all these events that have that City Hall grant tag, now I can go back into reporting. And if we go down to that yearly participation report, I can say, hey, don't use all my opportunities, only use the previous search. And now if I run this report, it's going to pull significantly less information because it's only looking at all of the registrations that took place within the events that I had searched for. So now I'm only reporting on that particular subset of my events. That same concept can be applied across groups as well as volunteers. So maybe you want to view all of the hours served by a subset of your volunteer database. You could see, like, for example, all the volunteers who answered a particular question a certain way on your application. Maybe you want to see court-ordered volunteers versus altruistic volunteers, right? Or maybe you want to see a report of volunteers by age range or within a certain demographic. You could go into the advanced volunteer search, run whatever search you want to using whatever information you're tracking about volunteers or any other kind of metric like that. Maybe you just want to see volunteers who are new this year. You could actually run a search under account status to find volunteers that were entered into service between two dates. So maybe I only want to view the activity this year from people who created an account this year, right? So you could actually run that search first to find only new volunteers. And then again, go back into reporting, go down to that yearly participation report, say, let's use my previous volunteer search this time. And then I'll say all opportunities and then run that report, right? So this is the same idea, but now I'm limiting who shows up in the report, which volunteers' hours are being contributed rather than which opportunities apply. And of course, I could do both of those things at the same time if I wanted to. I could apply a specific subset of volunteers and a specific subset of opportunities. So you can get pretty complex results by using the different searches in the different parts of the database. And of course, groups is a part of that as well. Maybe you want to run a report on all of the hours served by all of your corporate partners versus school partners. If you've tagged groups in a certain form or fashion, like in my system, I tag a group as either corporate or youth group or a school group or like a church, you could search by those tags and then run a report on all the hours served by members of those corporate partners. All right, so then you can find like those kinds of results as well. So that search mechanic really enables different reports to be pretty robust. We've been looking at this yearly participation summary, which is just a report by month. But if we look at the first report in this list here, custom participation report, this is kind of the most flexible. This one pulls not just a summary by month. Obviously, you can use the queries here to limit what shows up in your report, or you can view everything. You can choose to include or hide group activity. You can also choose to include or hide individual volunteers if conversely you just want to run a report on groups. But then very importantly, this report also allows you to specify how much data you want to pull from volunteer accounts and how much information you want to pull from the events themselves. So this report is really robust because it allows you to specify, what else you want to include. Maybe you just want to run one big spreadsheet and then, use Excel to sort within that by ages or by other demographics information or by what tags are on those volunteers' profiles. So you can just sort the columns by those tags or by those ages and then kind of run your own reports within Excel once you've pulled this. So this report is pretty robust in that you can do kind of one large scale report with a lot of information and then use that to kind of build out other charts or things like that if you need to. So kind of the main point of this report is kind of applying the queries, right? So you're searching for a subset of your database, or you can say, just show me everything, which again, that's kind of the default. And then the other main point is that you can choose to include a lot of information. Now there's 2 detail levels in this report, high and low. Low detail is going to give you a summary for each person. So I'm going to go ahead and run this report for the date range, and I just have age and tag selected here, as well as the volunteer's name and of course their totals. This is going to run as a spreadsheet because that's how this report is always run. If we go ahead and run this report, you'll see that this pulls up that CSV file, and this is just a plain spreadsheet. You can see each of those columns that I had selected, or each of those pieces of data I had selected, show up as their own column, right? So the age, the tags, those show up independently in here. And then of course we get the totals for the registration count and the hours served. If I just want to quickly see like who served the most hours last year, I could run this report and then sort by this column. And then I've suddenly got that information just laid out right in front of me. Right? So this is a pretty powerful report just in terms of the fact that it produces a very simple spreadsheet, which you can then use after the fact. So this is the low detail version of that report. The high detail version is going to be, again, basically the same concept, except that we're including every single registration, which means we can also include things like the sign-in date and time, registration notes, registration source, if they used a reservation code. You can include impact tracking metrics in this report as well, which is pretty substantial. Those can be included if you're doing the low detail report also. But then, yeah, this basically just expands on the amount of information you're including, and then every registration will be laid out as its own line or as its own row in this report. So a couple pretty important things about this report. Obviously, because you can apply these queries, it can get pretty complex, but you can save report parameters. And when you do that, what this will do is, if you give it a title here, you just call it custom report or whatever you're creating. You can make it private or shared. If it's private, again, only you and admin can see it. If it's shared, your leadership team and group leaders could also run this report. Of course, if they have their own restrictions, that would be limited to their set of volunteers anyway. But if we save this report here, now whenever I want to, I can rerun this report. And what saving those parameters does is it saves all of the queries that you ran. So I didn't actually run any in this case, but if I'd gone into the volunteer database and run a search for a certain subset of volunteers, gone into opportunities, ran a subset, of opportunities, I could have applied all those queries at one time. And then all the selections you make in here in terms of what data is included on that report, all of that gets saved in the report parameters. So when you come back in here, you don't have to redo all of that stuff. You just click on load saved report parameters and then set your date range and run your report. So this is a pretty powerful tool because you can create those kind of templates. And then of course, how flexible it is in terms of what information you're actually pulling. Okay, well, there's a couple more things that I want to point out that have been added relatively recently, just to make sure you're aware of those things. We talked about tags a little bit already today. Tags are a very powerful reporting tool because you can run searches on tags, right? I used the example earlier of a grant. I have a specific subset of events that apply toward a certain grant. And just as a reminder, the way you add those in, you click on an event, click on manage up at the top here, click on add opportunity tag. We also recently added stickers, which is what all these icons are here. We did a webinar on that recently. But basically using tags is, in my opinion, something you can't overdo because, worst case scenario, you have a bunch on the back end. They don't have to be public facing to volunteers, but then you can go and click on any of these tags to locate a subset of events and then run a report on that information. And then same thing on the volunteer side. I also want to mention there is another report in the report management called retention, the volunteer retention report. This is just kind of a nice way to quickly look at how many volunteers are sticking around year over year. You can play around with this report yourself. It's just kind of a simple one you run directly. It's a spreadsheet, and it basically just tells you how many people have stuck around year over year. And then I wanted to mention too, volunteers can also run their own reports. When a volunteer is logged into their own account, they'll see at the bottom of the page an option to view or print their activity history. And when they do that, they can run a report on a particular date range. So they can specify when they want the start date to be. So maybe they want to start in January also and go through the end of the year. they can specify that, select all the results, and then down at the bottom, they can either print this out or have it emailed to them. Maybe they just want to forward it on to someone else, but they can choose to do that directly through here. This option also to run this type of report is something that can exist in your sign-in console. This was recently added, but you can allow volunteers to pull this report when they are in the sign-in console. So maybe you have some volunteers who are court-ordered who just want to pull the report and print it while they're on site, maybe get a physical signature on the report itself. I do want to just quickly show you. When this report is created, it's a PDF and it has this verification badge down at the bottom. Basically, if someone is turning this in, the person they turn it into can go to this link and input this code or just scan this QR code to verify the veracity of this report. But this same report can also be printed through the sign-in console. There is a setting for that specifically. So and this is a relatively new feature. So if you haven't heard of this, this is why. But if you go into the system configuration, there's a section for sign-in console or kiosk options. And down towards the bottom of this, there's an option that says allow activity history access via the sign-in console. And you can say yes or no, or yes admin only. When this is turned on to yes, that means volunteers can access this themselves and email themselves a report, when they're signing out from a shift, let's say. Basically, that just shows up in the sign-in console as an option at the bottom of the page when someone is already kind of signing in or signing out. Okay, but again, volunteers can run that report themselves. And I did also want to mention that we have a YouTube tutorial on how to run that report themselves. So if you want to, you can send that to your volunteers. I wanted to mention this anyway. If you go to video.servicetech.com, that will take you directly to our YouTube channel. We have an entire playlist for volunteers, and one of those is, of course, how to print out your volunteer history. And this is just a quick video that walks them through how to download that report themselves. Okay, so we've covered quite a bit of information today. Obviously, end-of-year reporting is something that's pretty unique for each organization. I'm sure there were a lot of questions directly for our team that are kind of more specific to your organization. And if you do have any questions about how to pull specific information, please don't hesitate to contact our customer support team. You can use the Need Help button at the bottom of the page when you're logged in to do so. Click on Need Help. You can type in reporting here, and there's a lot of articles about how to run reports and different information in here. We do keep this up to date, but you can also click on Contact Us and submit a ticket through here to contact our customer support team, and they'll get back to you right away. All right. Well, thank you for sticking with us here. Thanks for your time. It's always a pleasure to see you in the chat. And I know I have met with a lot of you directly, so thank you for joining. We as a team are very grateful for the work that you do throughout all the different organizations and communities that you're serving and impacting. Especially at the end of the year here, it's great to be able to reflect on how much impact you all have in the different communities that you're in. So if you have any questions from today or really anything else, again, please use our customer support team. But thanks for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful holiday season.